Well, Dan, it's wonderful to see you and to get a chance to speak with you about your Elegy for a Lost Child. I wonder if you could just begin by introducing yourself and telling us a little bit about uh, your background as a composer.
Great. Well, thank you, Joel, for inviting me not only to have this conversation, but I'm excited that you've chosen to perform my piece. This will actually be the first time it's performed, so that is very exciting for me. It's certainly something I've been eager to share with others. For me, a piece that's, of course, very close to my heart. So I live in Chilliwack, British Columbia, with my wife and my two boys who are 9 and 11 years old. It's actually my eldest, his first year in middle school, so that's a big milestone for him and for us. Um, so I'm not a professional musician or composer. I love music. I've had the opportunity to perform in a number of ensembles over the years, choral ensembles, orchestral, jazz ensembles, both as a singer, also as a percussionist. I have had some vocal training, some percussion training, and a little bit of conducting training. So I've also had the opportunity to conduct some choirs um, over the years. Um, but my professional life right now, I work for an organization in BC called Bethesda. We provide services to adults and children with intellectual disabilities. So I'm in a senior leadership role in that organization, and I've actually been in that sector somewhat continuously, a couple brief interludes, but for I think it's over 24 years now. So that's something that's been close to my heart and something that's been an investment of my time and energy on a professional level. Um, yeah, and I'm also finishing up a graduate program right now in human resource management. So I like working with people, and so that's something that I'm actually moving into more of an HR role, hopefully in the spring if all goes to plan. And so that's something I'm working towards and excited to conclude. I've loved the doing the studies, but it'll be nice to do life without having to also add on graduate work on top of everything else, and hopefully
Yeah,
get back into some more composing too, because that
I was
certainly
gonna say, and then you
limits
might
my
even have
time.
a few spare moments,
Yeah.
maybe. No, that's terrific. So Dan, tell us a little bit about Elegy for a Lost Child. What's some of the background to this particular work?
Sure. Well, I introduced myself as living with my two boys. Often when people ask how many children I have, it's one of those questions that sometimes I'm not sure how prepared I am to answer that one because I we have another son, Joshua. Joshua, over 7 years ago, he would be seven right now. We gave birth to a beautiful boy. He was significantly premature, and at that time, we knew there were some issues. We knew there were some heart issues that were going on that he probably would need surgery for. But we had him at the Children's Hospital in Vancouver. We knew he'd need more care. We found out within a few days of his birth that he had a terminal condition called trisomy 13. And there's a couple different types of trisomy, but this was one that the life expectancy is not very long at all. So we had 32 days with Joshua, mostly in the Children's Hospital. We had a few days at Canuck Place in Vancouver, which is a children's hospice. So this piece is a more recent one. I wrote it probably, I would say, two years ago or so. Um, and um, it's expression of our own experience and my own personal and my family's experience. Uh, it's also at the same time an expression of a shared journey. With Canuck Place, they have parent bereavement support groups and for parents and siblings. And so for a number of years, we were a part of that group and we got to share in other people's stories of loss. And so in with this piece, it was a way to remember and honor the loss of Joshua, but at the same time intended to also there's a more universal element to it, remembering those that we know that share it in that journey, and as well as the many other people who have experienced the loss of a child. And I think that comes through maybe a little bit. I'll just note on the alto and tenor soloists, where you get a bit of the experience of the mother and the father, which speaks to both within our family, but also um, what I've learned from other journeys of grief.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. This is certainly a piece which is extraordinarily personal. But as you mentioned, it does resonate with so many who have encountered loss, and this is a very specific kind of grief. But I certainly can attest that many people who I've spoken to about this piece, there's a connection either personal or through family or close friends. This is something that I'm sure will really touch a lot of people. Um, was this piece sort of an intentional part then of the healing process for you? What has that been like? Just in terms of the timeline, you say that that this was written a couple of years ago, but had you been sort of contemplating writing a piece for a longer time than that?
Well, as far as the first part of your question, the healing process, it's interesting when you think about healing, you often think about a linear kind of progressive process of getting, maybe not getting over, but coming to arriving at a certain place. I think with grief, the journey is a little bit different and a little bit messier than that. And while there can be healing, moments of healing and various respects within that, I think for me, it's been more of the journey. The grief is something that evolves. It changes over time. It doesn't go away. Um, and so and for this piece, I wouldn't describe it as part of the healing process. I think for me, and in my own experience of the journey of grief, remembering is a really critical part of that journey. And by remembering, I mean, often we think about remembering as kind of this cognitive act, this recollection, but I think there's a deeper sense of remembrance when we talk about um, whether that's in faith traditions, when we talk about do this in remembrance of me, in this context of communion or remembering the departed. And I know that extends beyond the Christian tradition. It's more about bringing a past reality to bear on the presence, um, and also the sense of honoring, honoring and this act of love. And so I think for me, my personal journey is finding those acts of remembrance. And sometimes that's going to the cemetery where Joshua is buried here in Chilliwack. Um, and sometimes it's reflection and prayer. And so I would say in that context, this piece um, was more of an act of remembrance. It's a way to honor Joshua. I wouldn't say I had been, it's not something I'd been contemplating writing a piece necessarily for Joshua, but as I was thinking about, what was on my heart to write about, and in this piece, that both the text and the music are my own. Often I'm borrowing the text from others. Um, that was something that it was an act of honoring Joshua as well as the other children that I've known that parents have lost.
Mhm. Thank you. Um, so what would you say, speaking musically here, what would you say were some of your influences? And maybe this can speak more broadly. You and I have had opportunity to get to know each other a little bit, and I'm a big fan of your writing. And so I understand some of the influences sort of more broadly. And you spoke about some of your musical background as well. And so of course we bring these experiences to bear whenever we are sitting down and writing. But yeah, what musical influences do you think maybe can be evidenced in this particular work?
Sure. This is a question I really don't like, Joel, but I'm gonna try and answer it. But I'll first explain why I don't like the question, and I fully expect it's one that will be asked in conversations like this. I mean, the first is I'm not in any way a studied composer. I mean, my study of scores is very limited. I haven't taken a compositional class in my life. Something I'd love to do one day, I'm sure would enrich my composing if I do have the opportunity. But most of my influence, I would say, is kind of absorbed more by osmosis than necessarily um, kind of an intentionally and a more conscious influence. And I'm still learning and growing, so I'm hesitant to attribute any of my inadequacies to any composers. Um, but um, but that said, I will say a few things about influences. Some of the broad influences, a key one for me is the Orthodox Christian tradition, both the faith but also the musical tradition. Sometimes in explicit ways. The work I'm working on right now is actually on a theme that comes from the Orthodox faith. So I'm very intentionally taking stuff from either directly from Byzantine chant, for instance, or playing on that influence, and also composers like Arvo Pärt and John Tavener, who come from a Orthodox Christian tradition. I resonate with their music, and there's probably maybe a that common spiritual tradition that resonates. Um, and again, I have a fairly broad musical background, so I've sung in many different choirs and types of choirs. I've been in jazz ensembles, so there's probably, if I think about the Elegy, there might be moments where you might hear some jazz sonorities kind of in there. Um, but I don't know that there's any conscious influences necessarily in the piece. I know there's one moment in the Alleluia I thought, oh, that kind of sounds like this, piece that I've sung before, but that might have been more of an after the fact realization than an influence. Um, so, really, Joel, I'm happy for someone else to analyze my piece and say, hey, I hear this influence, and I'll just kind of smile and nod and agree with what you say. That's probably a better way to go because I can't necessarily, at least certainly for the elegy, I don't necessarily see a lot of conscious influences in that.
Sure. Well, and different from some of the other works that you mentioned, are maybe more directly related to Orthodox liturgical repertoire. Um, but certainly, I think you have a real gift for like just building sonorities in a really beautiful and intentional way. And there's also to my ears, and as I analyze your scores, there is an architecture which really works well. So there's a really beautiful flow. I'm sure that is something you're very intentional about in terms of carrying sort of the line through. And as a singer yourself, of course, you're really mindful of just the way each of those lines sit in the voice. You also have some background among your musical experiences. You've worked with men's choir, so you do tend to like really provide some interesting opportunities for the tenors and basses, which is always appreciated by those lower voices. And just the way that in the elegy in particular, from the outset, there is this sort of distribution of the narrative between the tenor and alto solos and the full choir, which does allow immediately for this sense of like a community that is really kind of supporting those solo lines, and that's something that I think is particularly impactful because it does like allow for those spaces which are which might feel like there's this more private or kind of more individual or maybe even kind of lonely expression, but that there is very quickly kind of this sense of allowing for maybe it's those supportive voices which at first are just there to listen. And so yeah, I think that all of that is a part of kind of your sensitivity as a composer, and I could go on, and I'm sure I will, but that's
Thank you.
that's
Those
all
words.
I think what makes your music really compelling. I wonder if you can share then about kind of the compositional process. So I'm always interested because I love to arrange and I certainly love to dissect music, but I'm not a composer of original music myself. So I'm always interested. Do you compose at the piano? Is it the text that generally you work with first? And in this case, since you also wrote the text, did that come about in a different way than it might ordinarily have come? And sort of what roles, specifically in this piece, but what roles do space and texture play in writing for choirs?
Okay, I'll try to cover all of those. But you threw a bunch at me there, Joel, but I'll try to cover those. So first question about my process, and you talked about the role of text, and you know, I strive to be very text centered in my compositional process. I mean, my by and large, my compositions are choral compositions, and so the primacy of text and the poetry and the contours of the phrasing of the text is very important for me. Of course, as you mentioned, I'm also a singer as well, so you know, I'm sure that comes to bear. So I generally I begin with a text, whether that's a text that I've taken, like my Psalm 129, for instance, is on a psalm. The piece I'm working on now, I'm actually is a collaborative work with an Orthodox poet, so I'm also working collaboratively. Or in the case of my elegy, where I've written the text myself. That generally is my starting point, and then the music is built around that text. That said, you know, I wouldn't say it's again, it's not this kind of linear process. So, you know, sometimes you know, the text certainly influences the music that I set it to, but you know, also the music itself, especially if I'm, you know, developing certain, you know, musical themes, you know, sometimes that music will also the text will be shaped by the music. So it's a little bit of a organic process. Um, I do, you know, I do tend to sit at the piano here and plunk things out and kind of work things out. You know, my fingers sometimes are work things out, seem to work things out on their own sometimes. Um, Sometimes I'll come with musical ideas. You know, I tend to, um, you know, I things kind of percolate. I think that's for me. You know, again, it's not just right from beginning to end, but you know, things kind of need to sit. Once in a while, I have this big kind of burst of, you know, maybe creative energy where things kind of flow. But often it's, you know, I'll be somewhere and scribble an idea on a scrap of paper, or many times I'll be in my car commuting to work and I'll put on the record on my cell phone and then sing, you know, this idea then maybe that comes into my mind that I may or may not use, but I don't want to forget. So it really is. It's, you know, it's a process that maybe not super structured. It just kind of it unfolds depending on depending on when I can fit in time to actually work on my pieces too, and my state of mind. So, but I would say all of that that I, you know, definitely text is central to my process and how I come up with my the musical aspect of the works. Um, And sorry, the second part you asked about space and texture, was that right?
Yeah, yeah, just especially because, you know, again, I think that you are really you're really intentional about kind of the architecture of your work, and because we work together on Psalm 129 with another ensemble in BC, and that happened to be a three movement work essentially. So the idea of kind of space, but also kind of like the variability of texture in that case, because there was actually different voicing between one of the movements and others.
Yeah.
Um, like I kind of am remembering that as I'm
Mhm.
looking at Elegy as well, and just thinking about kind of the way that the parts of the sections of the work kind of work together.
Sure. Well, in terms of space, I mean, and I think there's maybe connection with the first movement of the Psalm 129 and the Elegy, of course, De Profundis out of the depths. There's certainly that kind of cry of the heart. And I think in both that movement of the psalm and elegy, especially the opening of the elegy, where you know it's using space and even silence, you know, that kind of that almost heaving heart kind of, you know, depiction. between the kind of those cries and the interluding silence. So, I do find that using space in terms of acoustic space, sometimes can add some power to the piece. And I think as far as both space and texture, I mean, there's this ability to intensify or diminish energy or emotive intensity, by how you add, texture, how you add layers, or how you interweave various themes. And the elegy, of course, the solo lines, for instance, where they um, interweave with the chorus, especially that come back at the end, right, in the Alleluia. So I think that kind of builds on texture. Um, as well, and of course, how it paints the text and whether it's evoking certain images or just the kind of emotive colors, within the text that building on that and the use of both texture and space. So again, it depends on the piece and what I'm what's trying to portray, but yeah, I would say. I mean, there's so many ways to use texture and space, and again, I think really the text and the intention of the piece drives how that's all put together.
Yeah. And again, because you speak of some of the influences in terms of Arvo Pärt and, Tavener or these
Yeah.
other things. Not that I'm suggesting this is derivative at all of those composers. And yet, we all come with whatever that sort of soundtrack is. And so when I'm listening to a piece of music, I can't help but, remember that I've heard an Alleluia by John Tavener or by Mozart or by whomever, and I sort of like have a way in my mind of maybe kind of categorizing and helping to kind of like understand the meaning of the text, but also maybe the meaning of the music in a way as well, sort of by kind of comparing or by kind of understanding kind of by association in these different settings. So that certainly speaks like that spiritual resonance, I think, as well, does
Yeah.
speak through a work like this. And I think sometimes the most emotive way of presenting an idea is by like observing that moment of silence or that moment of of space. So
And that
um
silence too is an expression, right? I mean,
right.
it's not just an absence, but it is something that it's creating space sometimes for the divine or for entering within oneself, right? So there is something both personally, but also musically that I think it offers. It's positive, a positive contribution to the piece.
Hmm. That's well put. Um, so, and this is another like maybe difficult question to answer. I wanted to sort of think in terms of broad strokes, but I really do. I mean this when I say it. And I've spoken of the piece, already to many folks. Some who will be in the choir, of course, and some who will likely be in the audiences. And I wonder a couple things. One is that, of course, this is something that um, is going to be so, it's going to resonate so closely and so specifically with some people that it may, in fact, be difficult to hear. It
Yeah.
may be difficult to sing, and that's not because you've intentionally, written something that is meant to be hard to hear in terms of the sound. It's beautiful sonorities that you've created. But it really is a piece that's going to, I think, speak so directly to the heart. And so I want to be sensitive as I work through this, even just sort of reflecting on my own journey of being a dad, but also of my own journey as I, meet many who have, stories of loss and of grief. So how would you hope that audiences are able to receive this, or what might be a way that you would sort of that you would introduce this piece to an audience? I guess that's looking at two different, the sort of the before and the after, maybe
Um,
for an audience.
yeah. Well, I do recognize this. this is a hard one to program. I remember having a conversation with you when we were contemplating programming it out here on the West Coast, and how does one program a piece like this? It is difficult, especially, I mean, if you're a parent or if you've experienced any kind of loss, that could have a very, like you say, direct impact. Um, one of the things, I would hope that people can, resonate with that grieving experience. But, I think about my time with the Canuck Place, the bereavement group, and Deborah, who was the therapist who ran the group, who's just one of the, someone who's had such a tremendous impact on my life and many others. But I remember something that she articulated, which has sat with me, is that at the heart of grief is love. We grieve because we love, right? And so, in whatever way we grieve in whatever way that comes out, through sadness, through anger, through, you know, um, at the behind that is an act of love and honoring the one that we've lost. And so, I think that's something that I hope, that the audience can come away with, is that behind this journey is the love of the one that has been lost. And the other thing is, of course, I'm writing from within a faith perspective, that sense of, that hope and peace, they don't eradicate grief and any of the emotions that come with that, but they can coexist, in that faith and hope, um, and in that act of grief, which is it comes from love. I think that's something that, whether or not people resonate with that journey personally or not, that they can bear witness, to how love can be both, a source of grief, but also a way to, transform grief into something that transcends the pain. So I think um, that's something I would like, people to, perhaps be able to come away with, and to share in this, if only for a moment, share in this journey along with me, um, and take away, take away that sense that grief and love and faith and hope, all of those, sometimes in very messy ways, can be intermingled, but that's all part of the journey of loss.
Thanks, Dan, for sharing that. And just to sort of contextualize this in terms of like the narrative of the program as well, the program that will be my first with Halifax Camerata Singers falls on the Remembrance Day weekend, which historically for Camerata has been an opportunity to not only oftentimes sort of identify and recognize those who have served in the armed forces, but also to more broadly sort of commemorate loss within our community, or to just remember those who have gone before. And so it seemed really fitting that sort of within that trajectory of these sort of memorial concerts and programs, that this would be an opportunity to really not only hear from you, but that we've sort of paired your elegy in a sense with David Lang's Little Match Girl Passion, which are two very different stories, two very different narratives. And both which in different ways, I think do connect with, yes, a sadness, certainly, also a message ultimately of hope, and that with both works there's also a connection to specifically a faith tradition. In David Lang's Little Magical Passion, there's a deep connection and resonance with Bach's St. Matthew Passion. Although the story is not a sacred one, specifically when it comes to the telling of the little match girl, but that in a sense, I think it also may help to give like a specific or allow for a space which actually contemporizes the David Lang. Like we hear from you in a way that tells of a very real a boy named Joshua, a very real story, a family, and is sort of a representative of many families' stories in a way. And that with the David Lang Passion, this is a story, of course, which was you know which was made up, but which does resonate, I think, in today's um, situation where we are really mindful, or ought to be mindful of the homelessness crisis, of so many who do struggle, who do have these journeys of a lot of heaviness. And so, yeah, it also helps, I think, in David Lang's passion to maybe like feel as though we can really put a real face to that the portrait of that little match girl. And I think ultimately the program hopefully does also point towards hope. And we certainly want to move through and honor these stories in what way we can, but to also point towards a sense of community and a sense of hopefulness. So I want to thank you so much, Dan, for your time today, and for your music, and look forward so much to sharing the final product with you after our
Mhm.
performances. We can learn more about Dan Steenburg's music by going to what brand new website, Dan?
It's www.danscompositions.ca, and that's all one word. So that is newly launched website. So yeah, feel free to check it out and comment too. There is my email address there, so I always love to hear any kind of feedback of any kind is always welcome.
Terrific. Well, we'll certainly share that with the singers and with our audience as well. Thanks again, Dan, for your time today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Joel. Appreciate it.